Useless. Clumsy. Can't you do anything right, Ruby?" Mrs. Harrington's shrill voice echoed through the mansion as hot tea burned my hands while I tried to gather the pieces of fine china that had shattered against the marble floor. The stain was spreading across the Persian rug she treasured so much, and I, on my knees, frantically scrubbed at it. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," I murmured without daring to look up, knowing any eye contact would be interpreted as defiance. "I'll clean it right away. Before I go on, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? I'd love to know who's out there, hearing this story with their heart." "Of course you will, and it's coming out of your pay, as usual. Do you think money grows on trees? You should be grateful I allow you to live in this house." Her words struck me like lashes, but I kept my face impassive, as I had learned to do over the past 20 years. 20 years of service, of humiliations, of absences, of sacrifices that nobody would ever understand. Or so I thought. Today, as my grandchildren sleep in the next room of my small house in the outskirts of Atlanta, with the sound of the city as background music, I've decided to break my silence. To tell the truth I've held for so long. A truth that even my children don't fully know. My name is Ruby Johnson, and I'm 72 years old. This is the story of how I sold my dignity for love, of how I became a shadow so my children could walk in the sunlight. I was born in a small town in rural Georgia, where the smell of red clay soil and fresh-baked cornbread filled the air. My father, Mr. Elijah, worked the fields that weren't his own. My mama, Miss Sarah, cleaned houses for white families and sewed quilts she sold at the church bazaar. We were poor, but there was dignity in our poverty, and love at our table, however, scarce the food. I was the oldest of 6 children, and for as long as I can remember, part of my childhood was taking care of the younger ones. I'd rise before dawn to help Mama start the fire, make biscuits for breakfast, fetch water from the well, wash clothes in the creek. Between chores, I attended the colored school, a small building with one teacher for all grades. Miss Olivia, the teacher, said I had a way with numbers and reading. "You have a clear mind, Ruby," she would tell me while checking my notebooks. "You could be a teacher someday." Her words lit a small flame of hope in my heart. Could it be possible? Could I, daughter of sharecroppers, aspire to something more than the destiny of my mother and grandmother? On Sundays, after church, when I finished my chores, I would steal away to the old oak tree with a book borrowed from Miss Olivia. I'd sit under its broad branches and read until the daylight began to fade. Those moments were mine alone, small, treasures stolen from time. Mama caught me one afternoon. I thought she would scold me for wasting time, but instead she sat beside me in silence. After a while, she stroked my hair and said, "Read, child. Read all you can. Maybe you can fly. Higher than we did." Life in town followed its age-old rhythm marked by seasons, church revivals, births, and deaths. I kept dreaming of studying, becoming a teacher, knowing places beyond the fields that surrounded us. But fate had other plans. I was 15 when a group of construction workers came to our town to build a new road. Among them was James Johnson, an 18-year-old with honey-colored eyes and a smile that seemed to light up everything around him. I saw him for the first time one Sunday, in the churchyard after service. Our eyes met while I was helping Mama sell her quilts, and something inside me trembled. James found excuses to pass by our house every day. He would buy cornbread from our table, ask about the weather, about local customs. Slowly, conversations lengthened. He told me about Atlanta, about his dreams of becoming a contractor, of having his own business someday. I told him about my desires to become a teacher, about the books I read, about my siblings. "You're different, Ruby," he said one afternoon as we walked at the edge of town, with my younger sister following at a prudent distance as an improvised chaperone. Your eyes light up when you talk about your dreams. I fell in love the way you only can at 15, without reservations, without fear of the future, with my heart completely open. James promised me the sky, the moon, and the stars. He spoke of a life together in Atlanta, where I could study, and he would work hard to give us a good future. My parents opposed it at first. "He's an outsider," Daddy said. "We don't know anything about his family, his intentions. Besides, you're very young, daughter." But love is stubborn, and I was stubborn too. After months of pleading, promises, and tears, my parents relented. James spoke with my father, formalized his request according to the customs of our community, and we got engaged. The wedding was simple, a white dress that my mother and aunt sewed for weeks, a service in the small church, a celebration with sweet potato pie and lemonade in the yard of my parents' house. James and I danced under the stars, drunk with happiness and promises. A week later, we left for Atlanta. I remember the journey on that rickety bus, looking one last time at the fields of my childhood as they receded in the distance. I felt a mixture of excitement and fear. I was leaving behind everything I knew for an uncertain future, but James held my hand, and that gave me courage. Atlanta welcomed us with its chaos, its noise, its overwhelming immensity. We settled in, a small room James had rented in a colored boarding house in Sweet Auburn. It was a tiny space with a shared bathroom at the end of the hall. But to me it was the beginning of our home, our life together. James worked in construction, and I found employment as a helper in a small soul food restaurant nearby. The first months were difficult, but happy. In the evenings, after long days of work, we would lie on our thin mattress and make plans. James would continue learning the trade. We would save. Perhaps I could resume my studies later. We were young, we were in love. The future seemed full of possibilities. Soon we discovered I was pregnant. The news filled us with joy and concern in equal parts. A child was a blessing, but also an enormous responsibility. James began working, overtime, looking for additional jobs on weekends. I continued at the restaurant as long as my belly allowed me. Marcus was born on a rainy dawn in September, a difficult birth in an overcrowded colored ward at the hospital. When they placed him in my arms, so small, so perfect, I knew I would do anything for him. Anything. Life became more complicated. With a baby, the room seemed smaller, money scarcer, hours of sleep a luxury. James continued working hard, but he started coming home late some evenings, with the smell of whiskey on his breath. I didn't worry too much at first. "It's the stress," I told myself. "It's normal that he needs to let off steam a bit." When Marcus was 2, I became pregnant again. This time it wasn't planned, and James didn't receive the news with the same joy. "How are we going to support another child, Ruby?" he asked with a furrowed brow. "We're barely making it with Marcus." Olivia was born at home, with the help of a neighbor who had been a midwife in her hometown. A beautiful girl, with James's eyes and my stubbornness, from day one. I loved her instantly, with that maternal ferocity that understands neither logic nor circumstances. By then things weren't the same between James and me. He drank more, came home later, sometimes didn't return for the whole night. Money was increasingly scarce. I had returned to work at the restaurant, taking the children with me. Marcus would sit in a corner of the kitchen, watching over his sister while I served tables, washed dishes, did whatever was necessary. One night, James came home especially late and drunk. We argued. It was our first big fight. He shouted that he felt trapped, that this wasn't the life he had dreamed of. I reproached him for his absences, the money wasted on alcohol. The children cried, frightened by the shouting. "I should never have brought you to Atlanta!" He spat in a moment of fury. "It would have been better to leave you in your town." His words hurt me deeply, but not as much as what I saw in his eyes. Resentment, as if the children and I were a burden, an obstacle to his dreams. That night, while he slept off his drunkenness and the children finally rested, I cried in silence. Where were the promises, the shared dreams? How had we come to this in such a short time? Things improved temporarily when James found a better-paying job with a larger construction company. For a few months, he was again the man I had fallen in love with. He came home early, played with the children, brought me small gifts. We even talked about looking for a larger apartment, saving for the children's education. But happiness didn't last long. One evening, James didn't come home. I waited all night, worried, imagining accidents, misfortunes. When he finally arrived the following morning, he had a bruised face, a swollen eye, scraped knuckles. "What happened?" I asked, helping him sit down. "I got into trouble, Ruby," he mumbled, his voice breaking. "I owe money. A lot of money." It turned out James had started gambling. First cards at the bar, then horse races. He had borrowed from dangerous people, and now he couldn't pay. "They'll come for me," he said, trembling. "And for you too, if I don't pay." That night I didn't sleep. I thought about my children, the danger they were in because of their father's mistakes. At dawn I made a decision. I went to see Miss Evelyn, the owner of the restaurant where I worked. "I need money, Miss Evelyn," I told her bluntly. "A lot of money and fast." The woman looked at me with a mixture of compassion and curiosity. After listening to my story, she sighed deeply. "I know someone who might help you," she said finally. "A rich white lady who's looking for a live-in maid. She pays well, but she has a reputation for being very demanding. Nobody lasts long with her. That's how I met Mrs. Eleanor Harrington, widow of an important businessman, owner of a mansion in Buckhead. She hired me that same day, more impressed by my desperation than by my skills. "You'll live here," she said coldly. "You'll have one. Day off every 2 weeks. Your salary will be good, but any damage or theft will come out of your pay." That same afternoon, with the first advance on my salary, I paid part of James's debt. Then I packed what little I had and said goodbye to my children, promising that I would see them soon, that everything would be better. Marcus, barely 5 years old, hugged me tightly. Olivia, 3, cried, without understanding why her mama was leaving. "Take care of them," I told James, looking him in the eyes. "This is your last chance." And so began my life as a servant, or rather, as a slave in Mrs. Harrington's house. Endless days that began at 5 in the morning and ended when she went to bed. I cleaned, cooked, washed, ironed. I endured her shouts, her humiliations, her impossible demands. Every 2 weeks I visited my children. I brought them gifts, new clothes, food. I promised that soon we would be together, that it was only temporary. They grew up without me, but at least they were safe, fed, with a roof over their heads. James kept his word at first. He stopped drinking, found stable work, took good care of the children. He even managed to get them into a better school, thanks to the money I sent. But happiness was short-lived. A year after I started working for Mrs. Harrington, I received a phone call that would change everything again. Miss Evelyn's voice trembled on the other end of the phone. "Ruby, you need to come. It's James. There's been an accident." I asked permission from Mrs. Harrington. For the first time, I saw something resembling compassion in her eyes when I explained the situation. "You may go," she said dryly, "but come back tomorrow." I arrived at our boarding house at dusk. The neighbors looked at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Miss Evelyn was waiting for me at the door of our room. "Where are my children?" I asked, anguished. "With my sister. They're safe." "And James?" "Ruby." Her eyes filled with tears. "James died this morning. He fell from scaffolding at the construction site. They say he had been drinking." The world stopped. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like my legs wouldn't hold me. I collapsed, in Miss Evelyn's arms, unable to process the news. James, my James, the boy with the easy smile who had promised me the moon and the stars, the father of my children, gone. The funeral was brief and simple. There was no money for more. His co-workers paid for the casket. The neighbors brought food and coffee. My children, too young to fully understand, looked at me confused, asking when Daddy would come back. "Daddy has gone to heaven," I explained that night, holding them tightly. "But I'm here. I'll take care of you." But how? I couldn't bring them to Mrs. Harrington's house. I couldn't quit either. I needed that job, that salary. We had no family in the city who could help us. It was Miss Evelyn who proposed the solution. "My sister can look after them while you work," she said. "She lives nearby. You can see them on your days off." There was no other choice. With a broken heart, I explained to my children that I had to go back to work, that I would visit them whenever I could. Marcus, now 6 years old, nodded solemnly. "I'll take care of Olivia, Mama," he said with a determination that broke my heart. I returned to the Harringtons' house the next day, as promised. Mrs. Harrington looked me up and down as I entered. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said without emotion. "But I hope you understand that this changes nothing. You have work to do." And so, among tears that I hid while cleaning, ironing, and cooking, began my new life as a widow and single mother. Every dollar I earned, every humiliation I endured, it was all for them, for Marcus and Olivia, who waited for me every 2 weeks with their little arms open. The years passed. My children grew up, went to school, made friends. I continued to be the shadow that cleaned the Harrington mansion, the invisible woman who served at elegant dinners, the one who listened without speaking, the one who existed only to serve. Mrs. Harrington was a difficult woman. She was never satisfied, always found faults, always demanded more. Over time, I learned to anticipate her wishes, to move silently through the house, to be efficient and discreet. I also learned to hide my feelings, never to show my sadness, my tiredness, my contained anger. But there were moments of small victories, of stolen joys, like when Marcus won a math contest at school, or when Olivia learned to read before all her classmates. On my days off, I took them to the park, to the movies if there was enough money, or we simply stayed in the small room I still rented, telling stories, laughing, being a family for a few hours. "Mama, why can't you live with us?" Olivia often asked, her big dark eyes full of innocence. "Because I have to work, my life," I answered, stroking her hair. "So you can study, so you can have a better future." Marcus understood better. At 10 years old, he already knew that our situation wasn't like that of other families, that his mother was making sacrifices for them. "When I grow up, I'm going to be a doctor," he told me one day. "And I'm going to buy a big house where we can all live together." His words gave me strength to continue, to endure one more day, one more humiliation. Mrs. Harrington had a son, Richard, who lived abroad. He returned to Atlanta occasionally, and each visit was a whirlwind of activity. In the house, parties, dinners, important guests. Extra work for me, of course. Richard was different from his mother. Kind, polite. He always thanked me when I served him coffee or prepared his favorite dish. Sometimes he asked about my life, about my children. "You must be very proud of them," he said once, after I told him that Marcus had received a scholarship to a better school. "I am, sir," I replied, surprised by his interest. "And they must be proud of you, Ruby. Not everyone would do what you do out of love." His words moved me deeply. It was the first time in years that someone recognized my sacrifice, that someone saw me not just as the maid, but as a mother fighting for her children. When Marcus turned 15, he gave me the news that would change our lives. "Mama, I've won a scholarship to high school. A good one, Mama. The kind that opens doors to college." Joy overwhelmed me, but I also felt fear. A better school meant more expenses, uniforms, books, transportation. "Don't worry about the money," said Marcus, reading my concern. "I'll work after school. I've already talked to Mr. Benjamin at the drugstore." "No, son," I protested. "You need to focus on your studies." "Like you focus on working for us," he replied with a maturity that left me speechless. "We're family, Mama. We help each other." Olivia, who was then 13, also wanted to contribute. She started helping Miss Evelyn at the restaurant on weekends. My children, my little ones, not so little anymore, taking on responsibilities, growing up too fast out of necessity. It was around this time that the incident occurred that almost cost me my job. Mrs. Harrington was giving an important dinner. Politicians, businessmen, high society people. Everything had to be perfect. I had worked since dawn, preparing the food, cleaning every corner of the house, polishing the silver. I was exhausted, but I couldn't fail. During dinner, as I served, the main course, my hand trembled slightly. A drop of sauce fell on the suit of one of the guests, a corpulent man with a thunderous voice. "Look what you've done, stupid!" he roared, rising from the table. "I'm so sorry, sir," I murmured, mortified, trying to clean the stain with a napkin. "Leave me alone. Haven't you done enough damage?" Mrs. Harrington intervened, apologizing profusely to her guest. She ordered me to retire to the kitchen with a look that promised consequences. When the guests left, she called me to her study. "This is unacceptable, Ruby," she said, with an icy voice. "You've embarrassed my house, my guests. Perhaps it's time to look for someone younger, more competent." Panic invaded me. I couldn't lose this job. Not now, when Marcus needed money for his new school, when we were so close to achieving something better. "Please, ma'am," I begged. "It was an accident. It won't happen again. I need this job, my children." "Your children, your children," she interrupted with disdain. "Always the same excuse. They're not my problem, Ruby." I felt something break inside me. 15 years of humiliations, absences, sacrifices, and this is how she treated me. Like an old rag that can be discarded? "You're right, ma'am," I said, with a calmness that surprised myself. "My children are not your problem. They are my life. Everything I do for them. I've endured your humiliations, your contempt, your impossible demands. I've been more a slave than an employee in this house, but I've done it because my children deserve a better future, and I will continue to do so, here or elsewhere." Mrs. Harrington stared at me, surprised by my outburst. For a moment I feared I had gone too far, that I had lost the job I so desperately needed. But then, something unexpected happened. A slight smile, almost imperceptible, appeared on her lips. "I see you have character after all, Ruby," she said finally. "All right, you can stay. But don't let what happened tonight happen again." That night, lying in my small room next to the kitchen, I reflected on what had happened. For the first time in years, I had defended my dignity. I had spoken the truth. And surprisingly, Mrs. Harrington had respected it. Perhaps there was more strength in me than I thought. Perhaps, after all, I wasn't just a victim of circumstances, but a woman who had chosen her path, however hard it might be, out of love for her children. With that thought, I fell asleep, dreaming of the day when Marcus would graduate, when Olivia would fulfill her own dreams, when we could finally be together, not just every 2 weeks, but every day. But fate had other plans, and soon I would face the hardest test of all. Everything changed the day Mrs. Harrington had a stroke. It happened during breakfast without warning. One moment she was scolding me for the too hot coffee, and the next, her face contorted in a strange grimace, words became incomprehensible, and her body collapsed onto the table. "Mrs. Harrington!" I cried, running to her. "Mrs. Harrington!" I called an ambulance immediately. The paramedics arrived in minutes. That seemed like hours. They transferred her to the most exclusive hospital in the city, and I followed them in a taxi, trembling with fear and concern. At the hospital, I remained in the waiting room, invisible as always. The doctors came in and out of the room with grave faces. I called Richard, her son, who was in Europe. "I'm coming right away," he said, his voice breaking. "Take care of her, Ruby. You're the only one I trust." His words surprised me. I had never thought that Richard held me in such esteem. The doctors finally came out with a diagnosis. Mrs. Harrington had suffered a severe stroke. She would survive, but would remain partially paralyzed on the left side and have difficulty speaking. She would need constant care, rehabilitation, a completely different life. Richard arrived 2 days later. When he saw me at the hospital, in the same wrinkled clothes, having barely slept, he hugged me tightly. "Thank you, Ruby," he murmured. "You saved my mother's life." Mrs. Harrington was discharged a week later. We returned to the mansion, but everything had changed. She, who had always been strong, dominant, was now confined to a wheelchair, struggling to articulate simple words, depending on others for the most basic tasks. Richard had to return to Europe on urgent business, but promised to return soon. Meanwhile, I was left in charge of everything: the house, the finances, and most of all, the care of Mrs. Harrington. My days became even longer and more exhausting. Besides my usual duties, now I had to bathe her, dress her, feed her, administer medications, take her to therapy. There was no rest, not even at night when she sometimes woke up screaming or needing help to go to the bathroom. My visits to my children became less frequent. Sometimes 3 or 4 weeks passed without my being able to see them. Marcus, now 16, came to visit me when he could, bringing Olivia with him. "Mama, you look exhausted," Marcus said during one of these visits, concerned about the shadows under my eyes, my emaciated face. "I'm fine, son," I lied. "Just a little tired." But I wasn't fine. The constant stress, lack of sleep, overwhelming responsibility were taking a toll on my health. I began to have intense headaches, dizziness. Sometimes I was short of breath. But I couldn't afford to be sick. There was no one else to take care of Mrs. Harrington, and I needed this job more than ever. One afternoon, as I was giving her medication, Mrs. Harrington looked at me with a clarity I hadn't seen in weeks. Her trembling hand grabbed mine with surprising strength. "Bye," she articulated with difficulty. "Yes, ma'am," I replied, surprised. "Forgive me." The word left me breathless. In 15 years, I had never heard Mrs. Harrington ask forgiveness for anything. "Forgive you?" I repeated, confused. She nodded with tears in her eyes. With effort, she pointed towards the bedside table, where she kept her therapy notebook. I opened it and saw that she had been practicing writing, with shaky but legible handwriting. "I have been cruel to you. Forgive me." Tears sprang from my eyes without my being able to contain them. After so many years of coldness, of contempt, this acknowledgement, this apology, moved me deeply. "You don't have to ask forgiveness, ma'am," I said, wiping away my tears. "You gave me work when I needed it most. Thanks to you, my children have been able to study, to have a better future." She shook her head, frustrated at not being able to express herself as she would like. She continued writing in the notebook, with a trembling hand. "I treated you like a slave. You treat me like a person. Thank you." From that day on, something changed between us. She didn't suddenly become an easy person. She remained demanding, sometimes impatient. But there was a new respect, a new understanding. She no longer shouted at me. She looked me in the eyes when I spoke to her. She even tried to smile sometimes. Richard returned a month later and was surprised at the change in his mother, at the new dynamic between us. "You've worked a miracle, Ruby," he told me one night as we had coffee in the kitchen after his mother had gone to sleep. "I've never seen my mother show gratitude or affection for anyone." "Illness changes people," I replied. "It makes us see what really matters." Richard looked at me thoughtfully, as if making an important decision. "Ruby, there's something I want to propose to you," he said finally. "My mother will need permanent care, and you've proven to be more than capable. I want to offer you a significant raise, benefits, and something else." He paused as if searching for the right words. "I want you to bring your children to live here. There's plenty of room in this house, and I know how much you miss them." The proposal left me speechless. My children, living in the mansion, being able to see them every day, have breakfast together, help them with their homework. "But will your mother agree?" I asked, doubtful. "It was her idea," Richard replied, smiling. "It's in her therapy notebook. She's been trying to tell me since I arrived. That night I cried with joy for the first time in many years. I immediately called my children to give them the news. "We're going to live with you, Mama." "Really?" asked Olivia, her voice full of emotion. "Yes, my love. Finally, we'll be together." Marcus, always more practical, asked about the details, where they would sleep, if they could continue attending their schools, if they would have to help with Mrs. Harrington. "Everything will work out," I assured him. "The important thing is that we'll be together." A week later, my children moved into the mansion. Richard assigned them rooms in the service wing, near mine. They weren't luxurious, but they were spacious and bright, much better than the small room where they had lived all their lives. Mrs. Harrington welcomed my children with a trembling smile. Marcus, serious and polite, thanked her for her hospitality. Olivia, more outgoing, began to tell her about school, about her friends, as if they were old acquaintances. To my surprise, Mrs. Harrington seemed to enjoy my children's company. She listened to them attentively, tried to communicate with them. Through her notebook, even seemed more animated during her therapies when they were present. Marcus and Olivia adapted quickly to the new situation. They continued attending their schools. But now I could prepare their breakfast, say goodbye at the door, welcome them when they returned. Olivia began to help me with some household chores, and Marcus sometimes accompanied Mrs. Harrington during her reading sessions, reading her the newspaper or books she enjoyed. "Your son is very intelligent," Mrs. Harrington wrote in her notebook one day. "He should go to college." "That's his dream," I replied. "He wants to study medicine." She nodded, thoughtful. The next day, when Richard came to visit her, they had a long private conversation. I didn't know what they talked about until Richard called me to his office that evening. "Ruby, my mother wants to establish an educational fund for Marcus," he told me, "so he can study medicine without financial worries." I was stunned. Mrs. Harrington, who for years had barely acknowledged my existence, now wanted to pay for my son's college. "I don't know what to say," I murmured. "Say yes," Richard replied, smiling. "My mother has never been a generous person. Let her be one now." I accepted, overwhelmed with gratitude. When I told Marcus, I saw in his eyes a mixture of disbelief and emotion. "Does the lady really want to do this for me?" he asked. "Yes, son. She says you're brilliant, that you deserve the opportunity." Marcus insisted on thanking her personally. That afternoon, he entered Mrs. Harrington's room and talked with her for over an hour. I don't know exactly what they said to each other, but when he came out, his eyes were bright with determination. "I'm going to be the best doctor I can be," he told me. "Not just for me, or for you, Mama. For her, too." The months passed. Mrs. Harrington slowly improved with therapy. She could speak better, move with the help of a walker, even began to regain some independence. I continued to care for her, but the relationship had completely changed. It was no longer mistress and servant, but something closer to a friendship between two women who had suffered and learned to respect each other. One afternoon, as I helped her comb her hair in front of the mirror, she asked me a question I'll never forget. "Ruby," she said, her voice still raspy but clearer, "do you hate me for how I treated you all these years?" The question took me by surprise. I reflected for a moment before answering. "There were times when I did, ma'am," I admitted honestly. "Times when I felt like an object, not a person. But I never let that hatred consume me. I had a greater purpose. My children." She nodded, looking at me through the mirror with eyes full of regret. I was cruel. I was lonely, bitter. My husband dead, my son far away. I took it out on you. "I understand," I said. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is that now things are different." "Thank you," she said, taking my hand, "for taking care of me, for forgiving me." "And thank you," I replied, "for opening your home to my children, for giving Marcus the opportunity to fulfill his dream." That evening, as we all dined together in the kitchen, a habit we had adopted, even Mrs. Harrington came down to join us, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. My children were with me, healthy, happy, with a promising future. Mrs. Harrington, once my torment, now almost part of our peculiar family. It had been a long and painful road. I had endured humiliations, sacrificed time with my children, worked to exhaustion. I had been, in many ways, a slave. But looking at my children, at their smiling faces, at their eyes full of hope, I knew I would do it all again, without hesitation. However, I couldn't imagine that soon I would face another trial, one that would put at risk everything we had achieved. The news arrived one April morning, when the dogwoods were in full bloom, and covered the gardens of Atlanta with a white and pink mantle. Richard called, his voice tense and concerned. "Ruby, I need to talk to you and my mother. It's important. I'll arrive tomorrow." I felt a knot in my stomach. Richard never came without notice weeks in advance. Something serious was happening. Mrs. Harrington immediately sensed my uneasiness. "What's wrong?" she asked, her speech much clearer after months of therapy. "Richard is coming tomorrow," I replied, trying to sound calm. "He says he has something important to discuss with us." She frowned, worried. "Is he all right? Did he say anything else?" "No, ma'am. Just that it was important." That night I hardly slept, tossing and turning in bed, imagining 1,000 scenarios. Was Richard ill? Were there problems with the businesses? Did he need to come back to live in Atlanta and want the house for himself? Richard arrived at noon the next day. His face was tense, with pronounced dark circles under his eyes. He gathered us in the main living room, something we rarely did. Mrs. Harrington in her wheelchair, me standing next to her. Uncomfortable, in that space that for years had been forbidden territory for me, except to clean it. "Mother Ruby," Richard began, running his hand through his graying hair. "There are problems, serious problems with the businesses." Mrs. Harrington visibly stiffened. The Harrington businesses, founded by her late husband, had been the source of her wealth for decades. "What kind of problems?" she asked in a firm voice. "Fraud," Richard answered bluntly. "It seems that William Taylor, the financial director, has been diverting funds for years, millions of dollars. I just discovered it." The news fell like a bomb. William Taylor had been a family friend for decades, almost like a brother to Richard, a person of absolute trust. "Impossible," murmured Mrs. Harrington, turning pale. "William would never do that." "The evidence is irrefutable, Mother," said Richard, handing her a folder with documents. "I confronted him last week. He confessed everything. He was investing in personal projects that failed. He tried to recover the money, but only made things worse." "Have you reported him to the police?" asked the lady, browsing through the documents with trembling hands. "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first. It's complicated, Mother. A report would mean a public scandal. The stocks would plummet. We could lose everything." I remained silent, feeling like an intruder in such a delicate family conversation, but Mrs. Harrington looked at me, as if seeking support. "How serious is it?" she finally asked. Richard sighed deeply. "Serious enough that we have to take drastic measures, sell properties, cut expenses, reorganize the entire structure of the businesses. And even then—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the message was clear. Even then, it might not be enough. "This house?" Mrs. Harrington began, immediately understanding. "It's one of the properties we would have to sell," Richard confirmed. "It's worth millions, and we need immediate liquidity." I felt the ground opening beneath my feet. If they sold the house, what would happen to us? Where would we live? Would I still have a job? Mrs. Harrington seemed to read my thoughts. She took my hand in hers, a gesture that would have been unthinkable a year before. "And Ruby? Her children?" she asked. Richard looked at me with a troubled expression. "I'm sorry, Ruby. I know what this means for you and your family. We'll help you find another place, of course, and you'll have a generous severance package, but we can't keep the house or the staff." I nodded mechanically, trying to process what was happening. Everything we had built in the last few months, the stability, the hope, was crumbling before my eyes. How much time do we have? Asked Mrs. Harrington. 2 months, 3 at most. There are already interested buyers. That night I had to explain to my children what was happening. Marcus, now 17, listened in silence, his face serious and thoughtful. Olivia, at 15, couldn't hold back her tears. "Does that mean we won't live with you anymore, Mama?" she asked through sobs. "No, my love." I hugged her tightly. "We'll find a solution. We always do, don't we?" But inside, fear was growing. Rents in the city were exorbitant. Even with a generous severance package, how long could we sustain ourselves? And what would happen to Marcus's studies? To the promise of college? The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Appraisers visiting the house, Richard in endless meetings with lawyers and accountants, Mrs. Harrington more silent than ever, immersed in a deep sadness. A week after the news, Mrs. Harrington asked me to take her to the garden. It was a warm afternoon, the air perfumed by the roses she loved so much. We sat in the shade of an old oak tree, in silence for a long while. "This garden," she said finally. "I planted it when I married Edward. Every tree, every bush has a story." "It's beautiful," I replied, not knowing what else to say. "Ruby," she looked at me directly. "What will you do when we have to leave?" The question took me by surprise. I hadn't had time to think of a concrete plan, beyond finding another job, another place to live. "I'll look for another job," I said. "Maybe as a nurse for elderly people. I've learned a lot taking care of you." She nodded, thoughtful. "And your children?" "Marcus wants to continue studying. Maybe he'll have to postpone college for a year, work to save up. Olivia, she's strong. She'll adapt." Mrs. Harrington studied me with her penetrating eyes, now wiser after the illness, after the suffering. "You've sacrificed so much for them," she said softly. "And now, when you were finally together." "Life is like that," I replied with a resignation I didn't really feel. "We take 1 step forward, 2 steps back, but we keep walking." She smiled slightly, a sad smile. "You're an extraordinary woman, Ruby. I'm sorry I didn't see it before." That evening, Mrs. Harrington had a long conversation with Richard in her room. I could hear them arguing, though I couldn't distinguish the words. When Richard finally came out, he looked exhausted but determined. "Ruby," he called me. "My mother wants to talk to you." I entered the room with some apprehension. Mrs. Harrington was sitting by the window, looking out at the garden illuminated by the moon. "Sit down, please," she indicated. When I did, she continued. "I've been thinking a lot these days about life, decisions, mistakes, about what really matters." She paused as if organizing her thoughts. "This house has been my prison as much as my home," she said finally. "I clung to it after Edward's death. I locked myself within these walls, with my bitterness, my loneliness. And I made you a participant in that bitterness. I made you the target of my frustration. Ma'am, you don't have to—" She interrupted me with a gesture. "Let me finish, please. When I had the stroke, I thought it was the end, that I would die alone, surrounded by luxuries but without true affection. And then you appeared, with your unwavering kindness, your strength. You took care of me not out of obligation, but with true compassion. You gave me a second chance." Her eyes filled with tears, something I had never seen in all my years working for her. "And now," she continued, "when you were finally reunited with your children, when Marcus is about to fulfill his dream of studying medicine, everything falls apart because of the greed and stupidity of a man we trusted. It's not your fault. I said, moved by her vulnerability. "No, but I can do something about it. I've spoken with Richard. We have a plan." She then explained to me what they had decided. They would sell the mansion, yes, but not immediately. First, they would divide it into 2 properties. The main house would be sold, but the old guest pavilion, a smaller but still spacious building at the back of the garden, would be kept. "We'll live there," she said. "You, your children. Richard when he's in Atlanta, and me. It will be more modest, but sufficient. And most importantly, I'll still be able to fund Marcus's studies as I promised." I was left speechless, overwhelmed by the unexpected generosity. "But why?" I finally managed to ask. "Why do this for us?" Mrs. Harrington smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her tired face. "Because in these months I've learned more about life, love, and family than in all my previous 70 years. Because your children have given me something I never had, the joy of a united family. And because you, Ruby, have taught me what true dignity means." Tears ran down my cheeks without my being able to contain them. I knelt beside her chair and took her hands in mine. "Thank you," I murmured. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me," she interrupted. "Just promise me one thing. That Marcus will become a doctor. That he'll fulfill his dream. That all your sacrifice, all these years of separation, will have been worth it. I promise you," I said fervently. "Marcus will do it. For you, for me, but most of all, for himself." In the following weeks, the guest pavilion was renovated to turn it into a suitable home. It was smaller than the main mansion, but still spacious and comfortable, with 4 bedrooms, a living room, kitchen, and a small private garden. My children could hardly contain their joy when we gave them the news. Olivia spontaneously hugged Mrs. Harrington, something that would have been unthinkable months before. Marcus, always more reserved, thanked her formally, but I saw in his eyes the contained emotion, the deep gratitude. "I won't disappoint you, ma'am," he told her. "I'll be the best doctor I can be." "I know, son," she replied, surprising us all by calling him son for the first time. "You will be." The main mansion was sold to a foreign family, and the money helped stabilize the finances of the Harrington businesses. They wouldn't recover completely, but at least they would avoid bankruptcy. We moved into the renovated pavilion one summer afternoon. It was strange after so many years to see the mansion, where I had worked as a slave, now occupied by strangers. But the change didn't hurt me as I expected. Perhaps because, for the first time in 20 years, I didn't feel like a servant, but part of a peculiar but genuine family. Mrs. Harrington, who now insisted that I call her Eleanor, adapted surprisingly well to the simpler life. She even began to take an interest in household chores, wanting to learn how to cook simple dishes, to take care of her small garden. "It's never too late to learn," she would say, when I caught her trying to make biscuits with her hands covered in flour. And so, in that strange community we had formed, a new stage of our lives began. A stage where I was no longer a slave, but a companion. Where my children weren't bi-weekly visitors, but an integral part of our home. Where the past, with all its wounds and sacrifices, was slowly beginning to heal. But life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. And soon we would face a new challenge, one that would test not only our strength, but also the new bonds we had created. 3 years passed faster than I could have believed possible. Marcus, keeping his promise, enrolled in medical school and distinguished himself as one of the best students in his class. Olivia, following in her brother's footsteps, was preparing to enter college. She wanted to study law, inspired by the injustices she had seen throughout her life. Mrs. Eleanor, I never called her Mrs. Harrington anymore, had improved remarkably. She walked with a cane, spoke almost without difficulty, and had become a surrogate grandmother to my children. Every afternoon she and Olivia had tea in the garden, talking about books, politics, dreams. With Marcus she maintained long conversations about medicine, nurturing his passion with stories of her own father, who had also been a doctor. Richard came more often, and the relationship with his mother had blossomed in a way no one would have imagined before. Our small house was full of laughter, human warmth, life. As for me, I had found a new purpose. Inspired by my experience caring for Eleanor, I had taken nursing courses. At 55, I became an assistant at a community clinic 3 days a week while still taking care of our home the rest of the time. Everything seemed to be heading towards a happy ending, a deserved reward after so many years of sacrifice. But life had other plans. It all started with a pain in my chest that I ignored, attributing it to fatigue. Then came the constant tiredness, lack of appetite, occasional dizziness. When I was finally convinced to see a doctor, the diagnosis was like a punch. Advanced breast cancer. "You should have come sooner, Mrs. Johnson," the oncologist said gravely. "The tumor has spread. Treatment options are limited." I left the consultation stunned, with a handful of brochures on chemotherapy, radiation therapy, survival statistics. Cold numbers trying to quantify my future, reduce it to percentages and probabilities. I didn't have the courage to tell my children that evening. I lied, said it was anemia, that I just needed some vitamins, but I couldn't fool Eleanor. She knew me too well. "What did the doctor really say?" she asked directly when we were alone. And then I broke down. All the tears I had held back in the doctor's office, all the fear I was trying to suppress, burst forth at once. Eleanor embraced me in silence, allowing me to cry until I was exhausted. "What are the options?" she finally asked, with the same determination she had shown in facing her own illness. I explained to her the proposed treatment. Surgery, followed by aggressive chemotherapy. There were no guarantees. The odds were not favorable, but it was my only chance. "Then we'll do it," she said simply. "Together. Like you did for me." "I can't afford it," I admitted. "My insurance doesn't cover everything, and I don't want to be a burden to you. You've already done so much." Eleanor looked at me as if I'd said the most foolish thing in the world. "Ruby Johnson," she said firmly. "For 20 years you gave your life for your children. Then you saved mine when everyone had abandoned me. And now you're worried about being a burden. You are family, and family takes care of its own." The surgery was scheduled for the following week. I had to tell my children. It was the most difficult conversation of my life. Olivia cried, hugging me for hours. Marcus, always the strong one, the rational one, bombarded the doctor with questions, sought second opinions, researched experimental treatments. "I'm going to be with you every step of the way, Mama," he promised. "I'll talk to my professors, postpone some courses if necessary." "No," I said firmly. "You will not interrupt your studies. It's the last thing I want." "But, Mama—" "No buts," I interrupted him. "My whole life has been so that you and your sister can fulfill your dreams. Seeing you achieve them will give me the strength to fight." The operation was long and complicated. When I woke up from the anesthesia, my whole family was there. Eleanor in her wheelchair, Richard, Marcus, Olivia, even some neighbors and colleagues from the clinic where I worked. I felt overwhelmed by so much love, so much support. The following months were a roller coaster of hope and despair. The chemotherapy weakened me to limits I didn't think possible. I lost my hair, lost weight. There were days when I could barely get out of bed. But I was never alone. Eleanor, in an ironic turn of events, became my caretaker. She, who had once treated me like a slave, now served me tea, read to me when my eyes were too tired, held me during the worst episodes of nausea. Olivia rearranged her studies to spend more time at home, cooking, cleaning, keeping the house running. Marcus, true to his vocation, became the liaison with the doctors, monitoring every detail of my treatment. One afternoon, as I rested in the garden after a particularly difficult chemo session, Eleanor confided something she had never shared before. "You know, I had cancer too," she told me. "Many years ago, before you came to work for us." I looked at her surprised. She had never mentioned it in all these years. "Edward had just died," she continued. "Richard was abroad studying. I was diagnosed with uterine cancer. I went through surgery, treatments, alone, completely alone." "I'm so sorry," I murmured, suddenly understanding many things about her character, her bitterness in those years. I survived, but something in me died then. Hope, perhaps. I became hard, bitter. I built walls to protect myself from pain, from loneliness. And inside those walls, I became a monster to people like you. She took my hand in hers, now as fragile as mine. "That's why I know you'll survive too, Ruby. Because you're not alone. Because you have something to fight for. And because you're stronger than I ever was." Her words gave me a new perspective, a new courage to face each day, each treatment, each moment of pain or despair. The road was long and difficult. There were days when I wanted to give up, when the pain and fatigue seemed too much to bear. But then I would see Marcus studying late, preparing for his exams while monitoring my medications. I would see Olivia, still so young, taking on adult responsibilities without complaining. I would see Eleanor, facing her own ailments to be by my side. And I would find strength where I thought there was none left. A year after the diagnosis, I received the news we had all been waiting for: remission. The cancer had receded. It wasn't a definitive cure. I would have to continue with treatments, regular checkups, live with uncertainty. But it was a victory, a gift of time I didn't intend to waste. That evening we celebrated at home. A simple dinner, but full of joy and gratitude. Eleanor proposed a toast I'll never forget. "To Ruby," she said, raising her glass, "who taught us that true freedom isn't in serving or being served, but in loving and being loved." I looked around the table at these people who had become my family in ways I never could have imagined. Marcus, now halfway through his medical career, with a bright future ahead of him. Olivia, freshly admitted to law school, determined to fight for the rights of the most vulnerable. Eleanor, who had gone from being my torment to my most loyal friend. Richard, who visited us more and more frequently, finding in our peculiar family the home he had always yearned for. I thought about my long journey, about the 16-year-old girl who had left her small town with dreams and hopes, about the desperate mother who had accepted becoming a slave to give her children a better future, about the mature woman who had found, through pain and sacrifice, a form of freedom she had never imagined. "I lived like a slave in my employer's house," I said, taking the floor. "But I did it for my children, and although the road was long and difficult, I wouldn't change anything. Because every tear, every humiliation, every moment of despair brought me here, to you, my family." Marcus, always reserved with his emotions, had tears in his eyes when he spoke. "Mama, everything I am, everything I will ever be, is thanks to you. to your sacrifice, your love, your example. I can never repay you for all you've done, but I promise that every life I save as a doctor will be in your honor." Olivia, between tears and laughter, added, "And every injustice I fight against as a lawyer will carry your name, Mama, so that no one ever has to live as a slave for love again." Eleanor, with the wisdom that only years and suffering can give, concluded, "And so, Ruby, your sacrifice transforms into blessing. Your slavery into liberation for others. There is no greater victory than that." That night, while everyone slept, I went out to the small garden. The stars shone in the city sky, more visible than usual. I breathed deeply the fresh air, feeling every part of my body, every beat of my heart, every moment of this life I had nearly lost. It had been a long road from that small town in Georgia, from that boarding house in Sweet Auburn, from that mansion where I had been a slave for years, a road of sacrifice, of pain, but also of unwavering love, of dignity preserved against all odds. Now, at 56, I had a second chance, to see my children achieve their dreams, to enjoy every day with the family we had created, to serve others from freedom and not from obligation. Life had taught me its most precious lesson, that sometimes we must lose something to gain something greater. That sacrifice, when born of love, is not a chain, but a bridge to true freedom. I, Ruby Johnson, had lived as a slave, but now I lived as a free woman, surrounded by love, with a future ahead that, though uncertain, was full of hope. And that, I thought as the first light of dawn tinted the sky pink, is the sweetest victory of all.
Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to our channel and stay with us for the next story. It's already waiting for you on the screen. Because every story told by a grandmother carries the strength of generations. Click and keep listening. We'll be right here.